On the morning of November 11th, 1778, roughly 300 Continental soldiers and 60 frontier families woke beneath a snowstorm on the western edge of New York. They were the breadbasket of George Washington's army. They were 60 miles from Albany and 1,000 miles from the war the history books would remember. By nightfall, the village of Cherry Valley had ceased to exist. Not a barn left standing, not a house. More than 30 civilians dead in the snow. Farmers, mothers, children, a minister's wife, a judge at his morning prayers. 16 soldiers dead beside them. 70 more dragged west into the wilderness as the village burned behind them. Picture one moment from inside it. A colonel, the man entrusted with all those lives, sprinting across 400 yards of open ground toward the safety of a fort he had refused to live in. A warrior closing the distance behind him. The colonel turns, raises his pistol, and pulls the trigger. The flintlock is soaked through. It misfires. He pulls again. Nothing. The weather he had insisted no enemy could possibly march through has just jammed the only weapon between him and death. A tomahawk crosses the gap. It strikes him in the forehead. He is dead before he hits the snow. That colonel had been warned. 5 days earlier, a dispatch reached his desk telling him exactly what was coming, from exactly which direction, in exactly what strength. He read it. He thanked the man who sent it. And then he explained, with the calm certainty of a professional soldier, why it could not possibly be true. This is the story of how he was wrong. But it is not only that story, because to understand why 600 men came through a snowstorm to erase a village of farmers, you have to understand what was done to their villages first. The towns burned to the ground, the winter food destroyed, a whole people pushed toward starvation that same autumn. Cherry Valley was not the beginning of anything. It was a single turn in a wheel of retaliation that was already crushing everything between the Mohawk and the Susquehanna. By the end of this video, you will understand how one officer's arrogance handed an entire settlement to the enemy in the opening minutes of an attack. You will understand why the warriors who came that day could not be restrained, and why 2 of the men leading them spent the morning trying. You will see the warning that was ignored, the secret sign that saved one prisoner's life at the stake, and the small blood-stained object that, a year later and 100 miles away, would tell one captive woman exactly how her friend had died. And you will understand the thing the propaganda never admitted, that Cherry Valley was not a battle between savagery and civilization. It was a collision between 2 peoples who had each, by November of 1778, learned to do the unthinkable to the other. These were not the linear battles of the eastern seaboard. There were no parade ground volleys here, no European generals trading courtesies. This was the other war, the one fought in the snow, against the harvest, against the unarmed. The one America fought against itself on its own frontier and then did its best to forget. Hit that subscribe button. Let us step into Cherry Valley. Begin with the land, because the land is why everyone died. The Mohawk Valley of upstate New York was, in the 1770s, some of the most fertile ground in colonial America. The rivers ran through bottomland so rich it seemed to grow grain by accident. Wheat, corn, livestock, orchards heavy enough to feed an army. And that is precisely what it did. As the Revolution ground on and Washington's Continentals starved through one brutal winter after another, the farms of the Mohawk and the Susquehanna became indispensable. The valley fed the rebellion. Strategists on both sides understood this with perfect clarity. You did not need to defeat Washington's army in the field if you could starve it in its camps. That made every farmhouse a military target. It made every barn a magazine. It made the harvest itself a weapon. And the people who raised that harvest, however peaceful their intentions, into the logistical apparatus of a war. Cherry Valley sat on the edge of it, 60 miles west of Albany, 13 miles south of the Mohawk River, near the headwaters of the Susquehanna, which ran south and west into the heart of Iroquois country. It was, by the standards of the frontier, an old settlement and a prosperous one. It had been founded in the early 1740s, mostly by Scotch-Irish Presbyterians and Dutch families looking for land at the literal edge of the map. One of the first was John Lindesay, a Scottish gentleman who built a modest house at the very westernmost bound of what colonists called civilization. Beyond him, nothing but forest and the territory of nations far older than his own. Close behind him came the Reverend Samuel Dunlop, a university-educated clergyman who in 1741 led a Presbyterian congregation out of Londonderry, New Hampshire, into the wilderness to build something permanent. And they did build it. Over a generation, the families turned forest into farmland. The Campbells, the Dixons, the Galts, the Wells. They raised mills and fences and a handsome palisaded church. They were literate, unusually so for a frontier outpost. They corresponded, they kept records, they educated their children. By the eve of the Revolution, there were roughly 60 families here, a thriving little world of grain and prayer and ambition perched on the rim of someone else's homeland. It was, by frontier standards, a place that had already won its gamble. The first generation's struggle against the forest was over. The second generation had inherited cleared fields, working mills, established farms with names and reputations. The Reverend Dunlop ran a school as well as a congregation and turned out young people who could read and write and reckon. A rarity this far from Albany. There was a social order here, a hierarchy of prosperous founding families and the households that worked alongside them. The ordinary fabric of a community that fully expected to be there in 100 years. Judges and ministers, and millers and farmers, christenings and harvests and Sunday services in the palisaded church. That ordinariness is the thing to hold on to, because it is what makes the rest unbearable. Cherry Valley was not a fortress bracing for war. It was a settled, comfortable, slightly self-satisfied frontier town that had stopped thinking of itself as the frontier. The people who would die in November of 1778 had spent the autumn doing exactly what people in a safe place do. Bringing in the harvest, mending fences, planning for winter. They had built something permanent. They had simply built it in the path of a war that had not yet arrived, on ground that someone else remembered as home. Remember the Reverend Dunlop. Remember the Wells family. We will return to both of them in the snow. Because here is the thing the settlers either did not understand or chose not to. They had built their prosperity directly against the edge of the Haudenosaunee. And the Haudenosaunee were not going anywhere. Colonial propaganda had a useful story about the people who lived west of Cherry Valley. It described them as primitive, wandering hunters, savages of the deep wood, an obstacle to be cleared like timber. It was a lie, and it was a convenient one. Because you can take land from a savage without guilt. You cannot so easily take it from a civilization. The Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, the people of the Longhouse, were a confederation of nations bound together for centuries before any European set foot in their country. The 6 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora, they governed themselves through one of the most sophisticated political structures in the Americas. A confederacy with councils and protocols and a constitution older than the one the rebels were fighting to create. Take the Seneca, the westernmost and most populous of the nations, the people whose fury would do most of the killing at Cherry Valley. They were not nomads. They were farmers. They cleared vast tracts of forest, planted fields that ran for acres, and managed hunting and fishing grounds with a precision that European observers, when they were honest, found humbling. Their towns held orchards that had taken decades to grow. Their society was organized into 8 clans across 2 halves, the animal side and the bird side, bear and wolf and turtle and beaver, deer and hawk and snipe and heron, bound by a matrilineal kinship that ran inheritance and identity through the mother's line. And the women held real power, not symbolic power. Clan mothers controlled inheritance, named the chiefs, and held the authority to remove them. A people the colonists dismissed as savages had built a political system in which women could depose a failed leader, something no European monarchy on earth would tolerate. Hold that image of Seneca civilization, the orchards, the long fields, the stored corn, the painted longhouses. Hold it, because in a year's time, the Continental Army will burn every piece of it to ash, and the memory of that fire is what will arrive at Cherry Valley first. When the revolution came, it did something no foreign enemy had managed in 300 years. It broke the Confederacy in half. The 6 nations had always moved as one, or tried to. But this was a civil war among the colonists, and it forced a civil war upon their neighbors. The Oneida and the Tuscarora leaned toward the American rebels. The Mohawk, Seneca, Cayuga, and Onondaga sided with the British Crown. Brother against brother, council against council, the great unity of the Longhouse fractured along the same fault line, splitting the colonies. That alignment was no accident. For decades, the dominant European presence in the valley had been Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, whose estate sat in the Mohawk Valley and whose relationships with the Mohawk and Seneca ran deep, personal, and profitable. Johnson had married into the Mohawk world. When he died, the bonds he built drew his native allies toward the crown almost by gravity. The rebels, by contrast, offered the Haudenosaunee nothing but the certainty that an independent America would want their land. And the split was not an abstraction. It was a wound that ran straight through the heart of the Longhouse. The Onondaga had always kept the central council fire of the Confederacy, the symbolic hearth where the 6 nations gathered to reach consensus, the institution that had held them as one for generations. By the late 1770s, with the nations unable to agree on which side of the colonists' war to take, that central fire was, by tradition, covered, symbolically extinguished. The Confederacy released each nation to follow its own path because it could no longer find a single one. Generations of unity, suspended because a settlers' civil war had reached into the council house and pulled it apart. The Oneida and Tuscarora went their own way under that release. Their alignment with the rebels owed much to the missionary Samuel Kirkland, who had lived among the Oneida for years and whose influence pulled them toward the American cause. By tradition, it was the Oneida who carried corn to Washington's starving men through one of the war's worst winters. Allies in the most literal, life-sustaining sense. And it was Oneida scouts, you will remember, who provided the very intelligence that warned of the attack on Cherry Valley. The warning Ichabod Alden dismissed came from Haudenosaunee hands, which means the deepest tragedy of the frontier war was not simply settler against native. It was Haudenosaunee against Haudenosaunee. Mohawk warriors under Brant and Oneida scouts, allied to the rebels, were now arrayed against each other as proxies in someone else's revolution. In the years that followed, the British allied nations would burn Oneida towns, and the war that had covered the council fire would leave the Confederacy that had kept peace within itself for generations, doing to its own members what it had once existed to prevent. The colonists did not have to conquer the Iroquois to break them. They only had to give them a reason to break each other. So the lines were drawn, and the frontier, which had always been tense, began to burn. In 1777, the conventional war in the North reached its hinge. The British defeat at the siege of Fort Stanwix and the catastrophe at Saratoga shattered the Crown's strategy in central New York. The redcoat armies that had marched to split the colonies in two were gone, captured, scattered, or pulled back to the coast. But the absence of armies did not bring peace. It brought something worse. Into the vacuum poured a different kind of war. Loyalist refugees, colonists who had stayed loyal to the king and been hounded for it, their property seized, their families threatened, fled west and north to the British stronghold at Fort Niagara on Lake Ontario. They arrived bitter, dispossessed and hungry for the homes they had lost. There they organized into irregular ranging companies, and they made common cause with the British allied nations of the Confederacy. Two grievances fused into one weapon. What followed was not the War of Saratoga. It was raiding, partisan war. The deliberate targeting of farms and villages and the harvest itself, designed to do three things at once: feed the raiders, starve the rebels, and draw Continental forces away from the main theaters by lighting fires the rebels could not ignore. Through the spring and summer of 1778, the frontier bled. Joseph Brant, the Mohawk war leader whose name we will return to, struck Cobleskill in May, Springfield in June, Andrestown in July, German Flats in September. Each raid carved away another piece of the valley's capacity to feed Washington's army. Crops burned, cattle driven off, mills destroyed. The breadbasket was being emptied one settlement at a time. And then there was Wyoming. On July 3rd, 1778, in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, a force of Loyalist Rangers and Seneca warriors under the Loyalist commander John Butler fell on the Patriot defenders of the valley. The fighting collapsed into rout, and the rout into slaughter. More than 300 Patriot defenders were killed. The exact number is debated, as these numbers always are, but the scale is not. The valley was systematically burned. Survivors fled east through the mountains with horror stories that lost nothing in the retelling. Wyoming did something important. It taught the colonies a word: massacre. It convinced the Patriot public that the frontier war was a war of extermination waged by barbarians and traitors. The pamphlets wrote themselves. What the pamphlets left out was what came next, because the Patriots did not only suffer the cycle of retaliation, they drove it. Remember this section. Everything that happens at Cherry Valley is an answer to it. In response to the raiding season, the Continental Congress and New York's Governor George Clinton authorized punitive expeditions. Counter-raids meant to strike the staging grounds from which the Loyalists and their native allies launched their attacks. The two most important of those staging grounds were the Iroquois towns of Unadilla and Oquaga, sitting on the Susquehanna River, deep in the contested ground between the colonial settlements and the heart of Confederacy country. In October of 1778, a Continental officer named Lieutenant Colonel William Butler, no relation to the Loyalist Butlers, one of the bitter coincidences this story is full of, led some 267 men out of the Schoharie Valley, Continentals of the 4th Pennsylvania Regiment and New York Militia. They marched south through worsening autumn weather to destroy those two towns. Understand what Oquaga was. It was not a camp. It was a town, one of the most developed indigenous communities in the region. More than 40 squared log houses with stone chimneys, glass windows, wooden floors. The only saw and grist mill in the area. Fields, livestock, orchards, the accumulated work of generations. A place that, by every measure the colonists claimed to value, was civilized, more solidly built than many a white frontier settlement. William Butler's men found Unadilla and Oquaga empty. Scouts had brought in a prisoner who confirmed it. The inhabitants, warned of the column's approach, had fled into the woods. So the Continentals did the only thing the campaign was designed for. They burned it, all of it. Every house, every chimney standing alone in the ash, the saw and grist mill, the only one for miles. They destroyed an estimated 4,000 bushels of grain, the winter food of an entire people. They drove off the livestock, 52 head of cattle and 49 horses by Butler's own count. They torched the vegetables, the poultry, the stores laid up against the coming cold. Then they marched back to Schoharie. The whole expedition done in 16 days. There is a point worth pausing on here, because it matters for honesty. Some later accounts attach lurid atrocity stories to this raid, but the reliable record is, in a way, quieter and more damning. The towns were abandoned before the soldiers arrived, and what the Continentals destroyed was not primarily people, but the means of survival. They did not need to kill anyone to commit something terrible. They burned a nation's winter, and the timing made that burning a death sentence. It was the eve of the winter of 1778, and that winter would be one of the cruelest on record. The Haudenosaunee had just watched their primary food supply for the season turn to smoke. There was nothing to fall back on but the British storehouses at Fort Niagara, and Niagara was a long, frozen march away. The destruction of Unadilla and Oquaga did not just burn houses. It condemned families to hunger and forced an entire population into total dependence on the crown. Women, children, and the old would be the ones who felt it first when the snows came. To the displaced Mohawk and Seneca warriors who survived it, this was not a raid. It was an attempt to end them, an existential blow, struck not with a blade, but with fire, at the food in their children's mouths. So when Joseph Brant's volunteers and the Seneca war chiefs came down out of the ruined country in the late autumn of 1778 and rendezvoused with a young Loyalist captain named Walter Butler, they were not soldiers looking for a military objective. They were grieving men looking for a reckoning. They wanted a target that mattered. A prosperous, defended, strategically important Patriot settlement, one whose destruction would answer fire with fire. They chose Cherry Valley. A raid is shaped by the men who lead it. Cherry Valley was shaped by four. Two who wanted the slaughter, and two who, in their different ways, would spend the day trying to stop it. Start with the man whose name the colonies would come to hate most. Walter Butler, 25 years old, son of John Butler, the Loyalist commander who had led the Wyoming raid, which meant the Butler name already carried the stink of massacre before Walter ever took the field. He had been trained as a lawyer in Albany, a young man of the colonial elite. Before the war split his loyalties from his neighbors. In 1775, he fled to Montreal to serve the crown. Captured by American forces in 1777, he was court-martialed, condemned to hang as a spy, and then reprieved, only to be locked in a prison in Albany under conditions foul enough to wreck a man's health and harden whatever was left of his heart. In 1778, he escaped. He made his way back to Fort Niagara, carrying a hatred for the Patriots that had been refined to something pure by months in a cell. His father commissioned him a captain in the Rangers, and the Cherry Valley Expedition became his first independent command. Here is the problem with Walter Butler. He was burning with vengeance, yes, but he was not his father, and he was not Sir William Johnson. He did not have the cultural fluency, the diplomatic touch, the deep relationships with the native leaders that frontier command absolutely required. He thought he could lead an army of the Haudenosaunee, the way a regular officer leads regulars. He was about to learn, at the cost of dozens of lives he would be blamed for, how catastrophically wrong that was. Then the man the colonies would call a monster, and who deserved it least? Joseph Brant, Thayan Danagea, a Mohawk and one of the most extraordinary figures of the entire frontier war, educated at Eleazar Wheelock's school in Connecticut, a devout Anglican who had translated the Gospel of Mark and the Anglican Book of Common Prayer into the Mohawk language. A Freemason, inducted into a lodge in London, of all places, during a visit to England where he had been received almost as a celebrity. A brilliant linguist, a man fluent in the worlds of both the Longhouse and the British court. By 1778, his reputation along the frontier was enormous, and increasingly, unfairly monstrous. Because here is what the primary accounts repeatedly show, and what the propaganda would bury. Joseph Brant fought hard, but he fought by a code. Again and again, the record describes him trying to spare non-combatants, women, children, the unarmed. He waged war on military targets and on the harvest, ruthlessly. But he was not in the business of butchering families. That restraint put him directly at odds with the Seneca war chiefs, who after Oquaga were in no mood for restraint at all. And it put him at odds with Walter Butler. The two men despised each other. Brant, older, vastly more experienced, deeply respected, bridled at taking orders from a younger, untested Loyalist captain. The friction got worse when Butler, trying to assert control, threatened to withhold rations from Brant's volunteers unless they formally enlisted under his rangers. You do not threaten to starve proud men into your chain of command and expect them to follow you into a difficult fight with discipline. The coalition that marched on Cherry Valley was already cracked down the middle before it arrived. Beside them rode the Seneca war chiefs, Cornplanter most prominent among them in the accounts, leading the warriors who had lost the most and forgiven the least. These were the men carrying Oquaga in their chests. To them, the white farmers of Cherry Valley were not innocents. They were the people whose army had burned their towns and destroyed the food their families would need to live through the winter. There was no such thing as a non-combatant in a war for survival. 442 warriors, by some counts. 320 by others. The exact figure is lost. The grief is not. That was the force coming through the snow. Now meet the man who was supposed to stop it. Colonel Ichabod Alden, 39 years old, commander of the 7th Massachusetts Regiment of the Continental Army, somewhere between 250 and 300 soldiers, assigned in the summer of 1778 to defend Cherry Valley. On paper, a competent professional. His experience ran to conventional engagements. The Siege of Boston, the orderly, European kind of soldiering where armies faced each other in lines, and the rules were known. And that was exactly the problem. Ichabod Alden was a perfect specimen of a deadly type, the conventional officer, deeply schooled in one kind of war, deeply ignorant of and openly contemptuous toward another. He arrived on a frontier that operated by rules he did not believe in, and he did not bother to learn them. He assumed an enemy thought the way he thought. He assumed weather and logistics, and the simple presence of a fort would do the work that vigilance was supposed to do. Every one of those assumptions was about to be tested, and everyone was about to fail. He was not entirely alone in command, and the contrast with the officers under him is almost cruel. Lieutenant Colonel William Stacy, a fierce New England patriot of the genuine blood and bone kind. By tradition, a man who had once torn up his own British Crown Commission in front of a militia gathering, declaring he would no longer serve a king who murdered his countrymen. He had been a soldier since the war's earliest days. Remember Stacy. His life is going to come down to a secret hand sign in the worst moment imaginable. Major Daniel Whiting, a veteran of the French and Indian War, which meant, unlike his colonel, he had actually fought on a frontier before. By local tradition, a former tavern keeper, said to stand 6 feet tall and to bear a striking resemblance to George Washington himself. Whiting understood wilderness war in his bones. When everything fell apart, it would be Whiting, not Alden, who held what could be held. So that was the board, a vengeful young loyalist who could not control his own allies. A brilliant Mohawk trying to wage a limited war inside an unlimited one. Seneca chiefs carrying the ashes of their towns. And on the other side, a regular army colonel who had decided in advance that the thing about to kill him could not happen. The pieces were set. All it took to start the slaughter was for Alden to do exactly what his character demanded. He obliged. Pause on the command problem, because it was the same disease on both sides, expressed in opposite ways. Authority and the ability to lead had come apart. And where they come apart, atrocity rushes into the gap. On the attacking side, Walter Butler held the authority. He carried the commission, he commanded the expedition, the Rangers answered to him. But he could not lead the men who would do most of the fighting. The Seneca chiefs did not serve under him. They fought alongside him for reasons of their own, and his clumsy threat to starve Brant's volunteers into formal enlistment had already told them exactly how little he understood the world he was operating in. Brant, meanwhile, had the opposite. Enormous moral and practical authority among the warriors, the experience, the respect, and a code that would not let him wage the unlimited war the Senecas had come for. So the one man with influence over the fighters would not order a massacre, and the one man nominally in charge could not prevent one. Command on that side was a contradiction walking toward a village. On the defending side, the same fracture mirrored. Ichabod Alden held the rank and was, by temperament and training, the worst possible man to exercise it on a frontier. Beneath him stood Whiting, who actually understood wilderness war, and Stacy, who had the fire of a true believer. The competence existed inside that garrison. It simply was not at the top, where the decisions got made. The men who could have read the threat correctly answered to a man who had already decided the threat was imaginary. This is the quiet horror beneath the loud one. Cherry Valley did not happen because of a single villain. It happened because, on both sides, the people with the power to stop it lacked the standing or the will. And the people with the standing or the will lacked the power. The massacre fell straight through the hole where leadership was supposed to be. As the danger grew through 1778, the people of Cherry Valley had done what frightened frontier communities did. They built a fort. It started with the fortified home of Colonel Samuel Campbell, pressed into service as a refuge. But after the nearby settlements began to fall, the village built something more serious, a palisaded stockade with bastions angled at opposite corners for artillery, thrown up around the village meeting house and the cemetery. They called it Fort Campbell at first. When Alden's Continentals arrived, it was renamed Fort Alden. A fort is only as good as the commander who uses it. And Ichabod Alden, given a fort, proceeded to make a series of decisions so poor that historians have struggled ever since to explain them as anything other than contempt. First, he would not live in it. Alden found the stockade's accommodations uncomfortable. So he billeted himself and his entire command staff, including Lieutenant Colonel Stacy, including the officers who ran the regiment, at the spacious, comfortable home of Robert Wells, a prominent local judge. The Wells house sat roughly 400 yards outside the protective walls of the fort. Sit with that. The entire brain of the garrison, the colonel, the lieutenant colonel, the staff, chose to sleep 400 yards beyond their own defenses, in an undefended civilian house, on a frontier crawling with the most effective raiders in North America. 400 yards of open ground between the command of the regiment and the only walls that could protect it. Second, he did not properly strengthen the fort or emplace its guns. The defenses he had been handed, he largely left as he found them. Third, and this is the one that should make you angry, when the terrified settlers came to him, begging to move their families and their valuables inside the stockade for safety, Alden refused them. Flatly. He told them the rumors of attack were false intelligence, and he added an insult to the refusal. He argued that letting the civilians bring their property into the fort would only tempt his own soldiers to steal it. He trusted his thieves more than he trusted the warnings. He left the people he was sent to protect outside the walls, in their farmhouses, in the open, because he had decided the threat was imaginary. It was not imaginary. It was, at that moment, marching toward him. This is the part of the story that elevates Alden's failure from negligence into something close to tragedy, because the system around him worked. The intelligence network did its job. Every safeguard functioned exactly as designed, and one man's certainty canceled all of it. By early November of 1778, the Patriot command at Fort Stanwix, held by Colonel Peter Gansevoort, had received reliable reports from friendly Oneida scouts. The Oneida, you'll remember, had sided with the rebels, and their intelligence was good. The reports were specific. A large force of Loyalists and native warriors was massing on the Tioga River with the stated intention of attacking Cherry Valley. Not a rumor. Not a frightened settler's nightmare. Sourced military intelligence, naming the target. In the first days of November, a dispatch carrying this warning reached Ichabod Alden directly. It told him an assault was coming. He answered it on November 8th. And his answer is one of the most quietly devastating documents of the frontier war. He thanked the sender for the warning, and then he minimized it. He expressed his disbelief that any significant force could possibly march on Cherry Valley through the deteriorating late autumn weather, through the cold and the coming snow. Read that again, knowing what's coming. The exact conditions Alden cited as his reason the enemy could not come, the brutal late autumn weather, were the exact conditions under which they would come. The snowstorm he treated as his shield was the enemy's cover. He looked directly at the thing that would kill him and saw a reason to relax. He did make one gesture toward caution. He sent a few reconnaissance patrols down the Susquehanna to watch the approaches. But his negligence had become contagious, and his scouts had caught it. In the day or two before the attack, one of these patrols was discovered by the advancing enemy, asleep, sprawled around a campfire, no watch posted, deep in contested country. They were captured without a fight, and captivity loosened tongues. From those prisoners, the British and native force extracted everything. The precise layout of the village, the exact location of the officers' billets at the Wells house, the 400-yard gap, the undefended judge's home full of the regiment's leadership, and the general state of the garrison's unreadiness. Think about the completeness of that intelligence failure. Alden had been warned where the attack was coming from. He dismissed it. The scouts he sent to confirm or deny the warning instead handed the enemy a perfect map of his weakest point. The attackers now knew not just that Cherry Valley was vulnerable, they knew precisely how to decapitate it. Strike the Wells house, kill the command, and the garrison would be a body with its head cut off before it could form a single line. The plan wrote itself. Hit the officers in their beds outside the walls. Surround the fort. End the regiment as a fighting force in the first minutes. before a single order could be given. It was a sound plan. It was made possible entirely by the man it was about to kill. And on the night of November 10th, under a sky already thickening toward snow, 600 to 700 men moved into position around a sleeping village that had been told to expect them, and told by its own commander that it had nothing to fear. Dawn on November 11th, 1778, broke ugly, a swirling, freezing storm. Snow tangled with drizzling sleet, the kind of weather that drives men indoors and dulls their senses and convinces a garrison that nothing will happen today. That was the gift the weather gave the attackers. Not just cover, but comfort. The same storm Alden had named as his protection now wrapped the village in a false, sleepy security. Sentries hunched against the wind. Smoke curled from the chimneys of farmhouses scattered across the valley, each one undefended, each one holding a family that had been forbidden the safety of the walls. In the Wells house, 400 yards out, the officers of the 7th Massachusetts moved through an ordinary cold morning. In the judge's home, the family had gathered for morning devotions. The attacking force was close now, 600 to 700 strong. Around 200 Loyalist troops, 2 companies of Butler's Rangers, and a detachment of roughly 50 British regulars from the 8th Regiment of Foot, and several hundred native warriors, predominantly Senecas, with Cayugas and a smaller party of Mohawks among them. The Seneca contingent led by Corn Planter. Estimates of their number vary widely in the sources, from around 300 to over 400. Men carrying Oquaga in their hearts, and finally within reach of an answer. The plan depended on one thing: surprise. Strike the Wells house and the fort simultaneously before the alarm could spread. And then, as these things so often do, the plan met the world. At roughly 11 in the morning, as the vanguard was still maneuvering into its final positions, a local farmer came riding along on horseback, headed innocently toward the fort, with no idea the woods around him were full of armed men. Some of the warriors, overeager, the discipline of the coalition already fraying, fired on him before the order to attack had been given. They wounded him, but they did not drop him. He spurred his horse and broke for the village, shouting the alarm into the storm. The element of total surprise was gone, and in that instant, the careful plan to decapitate the command quietly became a race to do it loudly. A vanguard of Senecas threw away stealth and sprinted straight for the Wells house. Whatever chance there had been of a clean, contained military strike died with the surprise. Now it was speed and chaos, and the 400 yards of open ground that Ichabod Alden's vanity had left between his officers and their walls. Inside the Wells house, the alarm and the attack arrived almost together. Colonel Ichabod Alden, the man who had dismissed the warning, refused the settlers, and chosen this comfortable house over his own fort, finally understood, in the space of a few seconds, the full magnitude of what he had done. And he ran. He bolted from the house and out into the storm, sprinting for the gates of Fort Alden across those 400 yards of open, sleeting ground. Every step of that run was a step he had created for himself. Had he billeted in the fort, the distance would not have existed. Had he let the families inside, the village behind him would not have been a killing field. He ran through the consequences of his own certainty, toward walls he had refused to live behind. A warrior came after him, closing the gap with the speed of a man who had run down enemies before. Alden was fast, and fear is faster. He nearly made it. He was within reach of the gate when he made his last decision. He stopped. He turned. He raised his pistol and aimed it at the man chasing him. The flintlock pulled the trigger and did nothing. The mechanism was soaked. The same freezing rain Alden had insisted no army could march through had soaked the powder in his pan. The pistol misfired. He worked it and tried again. Again, nothing. A dead, wet click in the snow. In the entire chain of his misjudgments, this was the final, almost unbearable irony. The weather he had named as his shield had just disarmed him at the one moment it mattered. The warrior did not miss. A tomahawk left his hand, crossed the last of the distance, and struck Alden squarely in the forehead. He was dead instantly. He was scalped where he fell, a few yards short of the gate, a colonel killed by the weather he had bet his garrison's life on. Who threw it? Local tradition, including accounts later associated with Judge George Clyde, sometimes claimed it was Joseph Brant himself acting in self-defense. But this is heavily debated, and most historians treat the identification as legend rather than fact. We do not know the warrior's name. We know only that Ichabod Alden died in the open between the house he chose and the fort he scorned, and that with him died the head of the regiment's command. At almost the same moment, a few yards back at the Wells house, Lieutenant Colonel William Stacy was taken alive. What happened to Stacy next is one of the strangest and most human episodes of the entire war. A moment where two worlds that were trying to destroy each other touched briefly through a secret older than the conflict between them. Stacy was captured by Seneca warriors. According to numerous accounts, he was stripped, bound to a stake, and prepared for ritual torture. The death meant for an enemy of consequence. The man who had torn up his king's commission was moments from a slow and terrible end. And so, with nothing left, Stacy made a sign. He gave the Masonic distress signal, the appeal of one Freemason to another, a gesture of brotherhood that crossed lines of army and nation and race. It should have meant nothing in a Seneca war camp in the snow. But Joseph Brant was there, and Joseph Brant had been made a Mason in a lodge in London years before. Brant recognized the sign, and he intervened, physically, directly, stepping between the bound American officer and the men preparing to kill him. He stopped it. He spared Stacy's life and took him prisoner instead. Hold the two images side by side because they tell you everything about the chaos of that morning and the men inside it. 400 yards out, a colonel dying in the snow because of his own arrogance. And here, at the stake, an enemy officer's life saved by a hand sign exchange between two men a war was trying to make into mortal foes. The same Joseph Brant the colonies would soon be calling Monster Brant had just reached into a torture and pulled a Continental lieutenant colonel out of it alive. But Brant could only be in one place, and he could only reach so far, because while one man's life was being saved at the stake, an entire family was being destroyed inside the house behind him. And that Brant could not stop. The Wells house had been chosen by the attackers as the heart of the strike, the place where the command slept. Now the Senecas breached it. Inside, the fighting was close and merciless, hand to hand in the narrow rooms and stairwells. First, the quarter guard of Continental soldiers stationed there was overwhelmed. Among them, men whose names survive in the record precisely because their deaths were so total. Thomas Sheridan, David William, Gideon Day. They were killed in the confined spaces where their numbers and their training meant nothing. And then the warriors turned to the family. The Wells household had been at morning devotions when the doors were broken in. Robert Wells, the prominent judge whose comfortable home Alden had commandeered, the host whose hospitality had unknowingly drawn the killing toward his own door, was struck down with a tomahawk while at prayer. What followed took only minutes. The household of 12 was annihilated almost in a single motion. Robert Wells, his wife, Mary, his mother, his brother John, his sister, 3 of his children, 3 domestic servants, 12 human beings, a family and the people who served it, erased in the time it takes to cross a few rooms. One death from that house became, more than any other single act, the emotional center of the entire massacre in the American memory. The death of Jane Wells, Robert's daughter. Jane escaped the house. She ran for a woodpile, a warrior in pursuit. And here the record preserves a detail almost too painful to repeat. Jane had grown up on the frontier, and she had learned the language of her Haudenosaunee neighbors. So as she ran, and when she was caught, she pleaded for her life in their own tongue. It did not save her. The warrior struck her down at the woodpile with a tomahawk. Remember Jane Wells? Remember that she existed, that she was a young woman who had learned her neighbor's language, that she died at a woodpile pleading in words they understood. We are going to meet her again, not alive, but as a single object, a year from now and 100 miles to the west, in the hands of another captive woman. The frontier had a way of folding its dead back into the story when you least expected them. The propaganda would take Jane Wells and make her a symbol. Innocence butchered by savagery. And she was innocent, and her death was monstrous. But the same propaganda would never mention the burned towns of Oquaga and Unadilla, or the winter of starvation that the Continental Army's torches had just guaranteed. The grief that put the tomahawk in that warrior's hand. One people's daughter dead at a woodpile. Another, people's children marked for the cold and the hunger to come. One cycle. That is the truth the pamphlets could not hold. And it is the truth this story will not let go of. While the Wells house was being destroyed, the second half of the plan unfolded around Fort Alden itself. And here, the attack ran into its one real obstacle. Walter Butler's Rangers, with a contingent of warriors, laid siege to the stockade. But the Rangers had no heavy artillery capable of breaking the walls. And inside, command had passed to the right man, at last. Major Daniel Whiting, the French and Indian War veteran, the man who knew wilderness fighting, took charge of the fort's defense. With its artillery, he held. For some 3 hours, he repelled the attackers, the fort's guns keeping the Rangers at a distance they could not close. The stockade Alden had neglected, manned by the officer Alden had outranked, did exactly what a fort is supposed to do. But here is the cruelty of the geometry. The fort held, and saving the fort saved almost no one, because the people who most needed protection were not inside it. Alden had forbidden them. They were out in the valley, in their farmhouses, exactly where the attackers could reach them. Whiting's guns could keep the Rangers off the walls, but they could not throw their fire 2 miles across a valley to defend a farmstead. The disciplined enemy was pinned against the fort. The undisciplined slaughter happened everywhere the fort could not reach. This was the structural catastrophe of Cherry Valley laid bare. Butler held his Rangers against the unbreakable stockade, keeping his disciplined troops busy on the one target that could not be taken. While the Seneca warriors, beyond anyone's control, swept through the undefended village at will. The men who might have restrained the killing were stuck in a siege. The men doing the killing had the whole valley to themselves. And so the houses Alden had refused to empty became the places where Cherry Valley died. Step back from the screaming for a moment and look at the machine of it. Because the raid that destroyed Cherry Valley was not chaos. It was a doctrine executed almost perfectly. And understanding the doctrine is what turns a horror story into history. A frontier raid was not a siege, and it was not a battle. It was a decapitation, followed by dispersal. The entire opening move was built around a single principle: kill or capture the command before the garrison can become an army. A regiment is not 300 men. It is 300 men plus the officers who turn them into a coordinated force. Remove the officers in the first minutes, and you are no longer fighting a regiment. you are fighting 300 frightened individuals who do not know where to stand. That is why the Wells house, not the fort, was the real target. That is why the captured scout's description of the officer's billets was worth more than any number of muskets. The intelligence told the attackers exactly where the regiment's brain was sleeping. 400 yards outside its own skull. Surprise was the multiplier that made it all work, which is why the overeager shot at the passing farmer mattered so much. With total surprise, the command dies in its beds, and the fort never organizes at all. Without it, you get what actually happened. A brutal, partial success, the command shattered, but the fort holding. The worst of both worlds for everyone trapped between them. And here is the cruel logic of the stockade fort. It was designed to protect soldiers, a concentrated military garrison behind walls, with artillery able to make an assault too costly. Against a force without heavy guns, like Butler's, it worked exactly as intended. Whiting's 3-hour stand proves it. But it could do nothing for a dispersed civilian population. 60 families do not fit inside a meeting house stockade, and even if they did, they would have to be inside it before the attack came, which is precisely what Alden forbade. A fort defends a point. A raid attacks an area. The geometry never favored the people who needed defending most. Finally, understand what the raiders were actually there to destroy, because it was not really the garrison at all. The strategic target of the entire frontier war was the harvest, the grain and cattle and mills that fed Washington's army. Killing soldiers was incidental. Burning the breadbasket was the mission. That is why not a single barn was left standing, why the mills were destroyed along with the homes. The Senecas came for vengeance, yes, but the campaign that sent them came for the food. A raid that left the regiment intact, but the farms in ashes would still have been counted in the cold ledgers at Niagara as a success. That is the doctrine. Cherry Valley is what it looks like when it works. What happened across the valley that day is best understood not as a battle, but as a series of small annihilations, family by family. The record preserves several of them in unbearable detail, and they deserve to be told plainly because the people in them were real, and the propaganda that followed turned them into cartoons. The Mitchell family. Hugh Mitchell was working away from his house when the attack began and could not reach his family in time. He hid in the woods and watched what he could not stop. When the raiding party finally moved on, he came back to find his wife and 3 of his children dead. A 4th child, a young girl, was somehow still barely alive. As he knelt over her, desperate to save the one life left to him, a second wave of attackers approached. A Loyalist soldier, not a warrior, a Loyalist, stepped forward and finished the child. Mitchell hid again, because hiding was all that remained to him. Later, he loaded the bodies of his entire family onto a sled and dragged them across the fresh snow to a mass grave. The Dixon family. William Dixon's home stood on a knoll below the fort. When the scream started, Elizabeth Dixon, born a Campbell, led her children up a steep hill and hid them in the woods beneath the freezing sleet. After a time, she believed the danger had passed, and she crept back down to the house to find food for her freezing children. A lingering party of warriors caught her there. She was killed and scalped. The next morning, her eldest child, still hidden in the woods, watching, saw a pole raised in the indigenous camp, hung with scalps. The child recognized one of them by its distinctive fiery red hair. It was her mother's. The Dunlop family. The Reverend Samuel Dunlop, the university-educated clergyman who who had led his congregation into the wilderness in 1741, who had helped build this village nearly 40 years before, was spared. He was saved by the direct intervention of a Mohawk chief known as Little Aaron, who had attended the same Connecticut school as Joseph Brant. The old connections of education and acquaintance reached even here. But mercy on the frontier was partial and cruel. Dunlop was spared only to be forced to witness the murder and mutilation of his wife. His home and the extensive library he had carried into the wilderness and built over a lifetime were burned to ash. He survived the day and was later released. He did not survive the wound. The Reverend Samuel Dunlop died the following year in New Jersey, broken by what he had been made to see. The Gaults. James Gault, an elderly man, one of the original settlers who had raised this place from forest, was captured with his family and immediately killed. Among the first civilian deaths of the wider village raid. A founder dying in the ruin of the thing he founded, the Clyde family, and against all of it, one family's survival. Catherine Clyde, wife of Colonel Samuel Clyde, gathered her children, including an infant, and fled into the woods. Through the freezing rain and snow of November 11th and into the 12th, they lay hidden beneath a large fallen log, listening to the yells of the attackers and the destruction of everything they knew, not daring to move, not daring to make a sound that the baby might echo. They were never found. They lived. In the whole grim accounting, the Clydes under their log are the reminder that survival, too, was real. That some of the children watching from the woods grew up to tell these stories. By every account, both Walter Butler and Joseph Brant tried to rein in the killing. Brant, in particular, was reported moving through the chaos, attempting to stop what he could. But the Senecas were beyond anyone's authority that day. And the reason was not bloodlust for its own sake. It was Oquaga. It was the burned towns. It was the winter starvation already closing in on their families. The warriors of Cherry Valley were not killing for sport. They were collecting a debt that the Continental Army had run up in their own burned towns. And no Mohawk chief and no Loyalist captain was going to talk them out of it. When the raiders finally withdrew, the count stood at more than 30 civilians and 16 Continental soldiers dead. And of Cherry Valley itself. The 60 families, the mills, the farms, the handsome palisaded church, the Reverend Dunlop's library, the work of nearly 40 years, not a single house, barn, or outbuilding was left standing. The settlement was simply gone, erased from the map in an afternoon, a smear of ash and bodies in the snow. It is worth sitting for a moment with what a number like 30 actually means, because the figure is small enough to slide past without landing. More than 30 civilians is not a statistic on this scale. It is Hugh Mitchell weeping over the mutilated bodies of his wife and 4 children, dragging them on a sled across fresh snow to a single grave, because there was no one left to help him carry them and nowhere left to bury them separately. It is a child in the tree line, recognizing her mother by the color of the hair on a scalp pole. It is the Reverend Dunlop, who had built this place 40 years before, watching his wife die and then living one more year with the watching. 30 is a number you can hold in one hand. Each one of them was a whole world, and each one ended within sight of a fort that had been told to keep them out. And the dead were, in a sense, the ones whose ordeal was over. The living had the harder road. The survivors, the Clydes under their log, the children scattered in the woods, the captives about to be marched west, carried Cherry Valley out of the snow and into the rest of their lives. Some of them would tell these stories 60 years later to local historians, which is the only reason we have them at all. The massacre lasted an afternoon. For the people who lived through it, it never really ended. The killing was not the end of the suffering. For some, it was the beginning of a worse ordeal. The attackers withdrew westward carrying roughly 70 captives, mostly women and children, along with the surviving Continental soldiers. The captives were herded into a valley 2 miles south of the burning ruins and made to camp there in the open, surrounded by the warriors, exposed to the freezing rain and snow without adequate clothing. While behind them, their homes burned down to coals. Over the next 2 days, something merciful happened. And it happened because of the 2 men the colonies would most revile. Through the direct intercession of Joseph Brant and Walter Butler, roughly 40 of the civilian captives were released and allowed to walk back to the American lines. The same Butler who would be cursed as a monster, and the same Brant who was already being called one, between them sent 40 terrified people home. It does not erase the day, but it belongs in the record alongside everything else, because the truth of Cherry Valley is that it was never simple. To understand why captives were taken at all, why a raid bent on vengeance carried off 70 people rather than simply killing them, you have to understand a Haudenosaunee practice far older than this war. In the Longhouse tradition, captives taken in conflict were not only hostages or leverage. They were, in many cases, replacements. A family that had lost its own members to war or disease could adopt a captive to fill the empty place. To take the dead person's name, their role, sometimes their very identity, and become a son or daughter or sister of the people who had captured them. Historians sometimes call this the Mourning War. Violence driven not only by territory or politics, but by grief, by the need to replace the dead with the living. Women and children were especially likely to be adopted rather than harmed, which is precisely why the captives marched out of Cherry Valley were predominantly women and children. Set that against the burned towns and ruined winter stores of Oquaga and Unadilla, and the logic becomes terribly clear. The Senecas had lost an enormous amount that year: homes, harvest, security, and the certainty of surviving the coming winter. Some of the people taken from Cherry Valley were taken to fill places the war had emptied. It does not make the killing gentle. The killing, it makes it comprehensible. The same grief that drove the tomahawk at the woodpile also reached out, 2 days later, to carry the living west into new families. The frontier was capable of both in the same afternoon, from the same people, for the same reasons. The captives who were not released were the families of prominent Patriot leaders, kept as political leverage. The most notable was Jane Campbell, born Jane Cannon, the wife of Patriot Colonel Samuel Campbell. Separated from most of her children, she was forced onto a brutal march of weeks toward the Seneca capital near present-day Geneva, New York, carrying an 18-month-old infant in her arms the entire way. The march was without mercy. On the second day, Jane's elderly mother, Eleanor Cannon, faltered in the snow. Too old, too cold, too slow for a column that could not afford to wait. A warrior, refusing to let the line slow for her, struck her down with a tomahawk beside her own daughter and left her body in the wilderness, unburied. Jane walked on, carrying her baby, having just watched her mother killed in the snow at her feet. When she finally reached the Seneca village, her infant was taken from her by force. A separation she would later describe as the most agonizing moment of her entire life. Worse than anything else the war did to her. She would be held captive for a year. And it was during that captivity that Jane Wells came back into the story. Remember Jane Wells, the young woman who died at the woodpile, pleading in the language of her neighbors. During Jane Campbell's imprisonment, a warrior offered her a small item taken from the plunder of Cherry Valley, a smoky cap. Jane Campbell took it and went still. She recognized it instantly. She knew it by a particular tomahawk cut in the fabric and by the bloodstains on it. It had belonged to her friend, Jane Wells. That is how the frontier returned its dead. Not with a grave or a name on a stone, but with a blood-stained cap pressed into the hands of a captive 100 miles away. A year later, a small ruined object that said, "Without a single word, this is what they did to her, and this is what was done in return." The military prisoners, Lieutenant Colonel Stacy among them, were taken on to Fort Niagara. And Stacy, twice now within reach of death, faced one last peril there. Molly Brant, the formidable sister of Joseph Brant and one of the most politically powerful figures at Niagara, was enraged by everything the Patriots had done to the Haudenosaunee. She lobbied hard for custody of Stacy, reportedly declaring she wanted to use the colonel's head as a football. It was the Loyalist commander John Butler, Walter's father, who defused her, placating her with rum and keeping Stacy under British military protection. The man who had torn up his king's commission, saved at the stake by a Masonic sign and saved again at Niagara by a barrel of rum, would survive the war. The raiders thought they had won a victory. In the narrowest tactical sense, they had. An American outpost destroyed, a regiment decapitated, the frontier terrorized. But Cherry Valley was about to detonate in a way none of them intended. Not on the battlefield, but in the printing presses and council chambers of a furious nation. The American revolutionary apparatus seized the massacre and made it a weapon. Accounts of the slaughter of the Wells family, the murder of Jane Wells at the woodpile, the families dead in the snow. These spread through the 13 colonies with the speed of horror and the polish of propaganda. The British and their native allies were framed as barbaric conspirators, the natural enemies of all decent people. Public outrage became a roar. Walter Butler became the most hated man in New York, a reputation that would follow him for the rest of his short life, until he was killed in a skirmish at West Canada Creek in 1781, run down and shot in the kind of small, brutal frontier action he had helped make routine. There would be no mourning for him, and Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, the educated linguist, the man who had pulled Stacy off the stake, who had moved through the chaos trying to stop the killing, who had helped send 40 captives home. Joseph Brant was branded Monster Brant across the colonies. The most restrained leader on the field became the face of the savagery. The propaganda did not care that the primary evidence pointed the other way. It needed a monster, and an educated Christian, English-speaking Mohawk made a more frightening one than the truth ever could. This is the bitter mechanism of the thing. The atrocity was real. The Wells family really died. Jane Wells really pleaded at the woodpile. And those real dead were then used to erase the other real dead. The burned towns, the ruined harvest, the starvation marching toward the longhouses. Propaganda does not invent grief. It launders it. It takes true suffering and spends it to justify whatever comes next. And what came next had been waiting for exactly this much fury to be set loose. The outcry over Cherry Valley handed George Washington something he had not previously had: the political capital to abandon a defensive war and launch a campaign of total destruction. The blood in the snow at Cherry Valley did not end the cycle of retaliation. It armed the largest turn of the wheel yet. Before 1779, Washington's frontier strategy had been one of containment, defensive postures, forts, the occasional localized retaliatory strike, like the one that had burned Unadilla and Oquaga. Manage the bleeding, hold the line, keep the breadbasket producing. Cherry Valley proved that strategy bankrupt. If a defended settlement with a continental garrison and a fort could be erased in an afternoon, then containment was a fiction. The frontier could not be held by sitting still and waiting to be hit. Washington concluded that the only way to end the raids was to destroy the capacity to raid, to strike not at the warriors, but at the world that sustained them. In the summer of 1779, he committed to it. He diverted nearly 4,500 Continental regulars, an enormous fraction of his available manpower, troops he could have used against the British on the coast, to invade the heartland of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Command went to Major General John Sullivan and Brigadier General James Clinton. Washington's written orders were explicit, and they are chilling to read even now. The objective, he wrote, was not merely to win battles. It was the total destruction and devastation of their settlements, and the capture of as many prisoners of every age and sex as possible. Not the defeat of an army, the unmaking of a people's ability to exist on their own land. The logistics alone testify to how serious Washington was. Clinton's brigade cut a 24-mile road through dense forest from the Mohawk River to Otsego Lake, hauling more than 200 bateaux overland to reach the water. Then, finding the upper Susquehanna too shallow to carry them downstream, Clinton's men did something audacious. They dammed the lake's outlet, let the water rise over weeks, and then broke the dam, riding the artificial flood downstream on its own engineered wave to rendezvous with Sullivan at Tioga. They reshaped the hydrology of the landscape to move an army. That is the scale of force Cherry Valley unleashed. What the Sullivan-Clinton expedition did to the Haudenosaunee homeland was, by design, not a battle. It was an erasure. The campaign fought almost no real engagements. There was a single major action, the Battle of Newtown, and a smaller ambush at Chemung. The Confederacy's warriors could not stand against 4,500 regulars with artillery in open battle, and they knew it, so they mostly did not try. Newtown, in late August of 1779, told the whole story in miniature. There, near present-day Elmira, a combined force of warriors and Loyalist rangers, including Joseph Brant and the elder John Butler, attempted to make a stand behind a concealed breastwork, hoping to ambush Sullivan's advancing column. But Sullivan's army was simply too large and too well equipped. American troops detected the position, brought artillery to bear, and maneuvered to turn the defenders' flank. Faced with encirclement by a force several times their size, the warriors and rangers had no choice but to abandon the line and withdraw. It was the only time the Confederacy tried to fight the expedition as an army, and it confirmed what they already feared. Against this much force, in open battle, there was nothing to be done. After Newtown, they fell back to the only strategy left to them: get the women and children away and let the towns burn. So the towns burned, and the burning was methodical, almost clerical. The soldiers of the expedition kept diaries, and those diaries record the destruction with a flat, bookkeeping precision that is its own kind of horror. This many houses fired, this many acres of corn cut, this many orchards destroyed. They did not merely torch the fields. They girdled and felled fruit trees that had taken decades to bear, ensuring that even if the people returned, the land would not feed them for years. They tore up what they could not burn. They turned an army of professional soldiers into an instrument of agricultural annihilation, and they did it town by town, field by field, with orders that left no ambiguity about the goal. The army marched into the Finger Lakes country and met almost no one. Because the target was never the warriors. The target was the world that fed them. Methodically, town by town, the Continental Army razed roughly 40 Haudenosaunee villages. Remember the Seneca civilization from the beginning of this story. The long fields, the painted longhouses, the orchards grown over decades. The army cut down the orchards. It burned the longhouses. and it destroyed an estimated 160,000 bushels of corn, beans, and squash. The staggering harvest of an entire nation, the winter food of thousands, turned to smoke in a single campaign. 160,000 bushels. Set that beside the 4,000 bushels burned at Oquaga that started this chapter of the cycle. The retaliation did not match the original blow. It multiplied it 40 times over. This was, in the plainest terms, an ethnic cleansing of central New York. More than 5,000 Haudenosaunee, men, women, children, the old, the sick, were driven from their homes and their food and forced westward toward the one place that might shelter them, the British fort at Niagara. And the British military infrastructure, never built to feed a refugee nation, was utterly overwhelmed. Then came the winter of 1779 to 1780, one of the most savage on record, with snowdrifts reported past 5 feet. 5,000 displaced people crowded against a fort that could not feed them in the worst winter anyone could remember, with no harvest behind them because the harvest had been burned. The result was exactly what Washington's orders had set in motion. Hundreds, by many estimates thousands, of Haudenosaunee men, women, and children died. Not in battle, but of starvation, exposure, and disease in the snow outside Niagara. The campaign achieved its tactical objective completely. It broke the agricultural backbone of the Confederacy, and it did the very thing that Oquaga had done on a vastly larger scale. It answered a fire with a far greater fire, and it guaranteed that the survivors would carry the memory of it as a wound that could never close. Here is the part the strategists did not predict, the part that makes the whole bloody arithmetic of the frontier so futile. The Sullivan Expedition was supposed to pacify the frontier. It did the opposite. It guaranteed perpetual war. The surviving Iroquois warriors, now stripped of their towns and their fields and entirely dependent on the British for survival, were not broken into submission. They were forged into something harder. They had nothing left to lose and one thing left to want. Their old chief, the Seneca leader Sayenquiragta, known to the colonists as Old Smoke, a man already in his 70s, gave voice to it. He told his British allies, in effect, that though they had lost their country, their arms were not feeble, and they did not consider themselves a beaten people. They would fight on, and they did. For the rest of the war, bands of Haudenosaunee warriors and Loyalist rangers rained fire on the New York and Pennsylvania frontiers. The destruction of their homeland had not removed them from the war. It had removed every reason for them to stop. The Mohawk Valley, the breadbasket, the prize everyone had been fighting over from the start, became a desolate, bloody no-man's land, raided and counter-raided, emptied and burned, all the way to the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and beyond. And the peace, when it finally came, delivered the last and quietest cruelty of the whole war. In 1783, Britain and the new United States made their treaty, and Britain, negotiating only for itself, signed away to the Republic an enormous expanse of territory that included the homelands of its own Haudenosaunee allies. The nations that had fought and bled and burned for the crown were not consulted. There was no native signature on the document. The empire they had served simply handed their country to their enemies and went home, as though the people of the Longhouse had never existed at all. After all of it, Oquaga, Cherry Valley, Newtown, the burning of 40 towns, the winter dead at Niagara. The Haudenosaunee learned they had been written out of the peace entirely. Joseph Brant called it a betrayal and led many of the Mohawk north into Canada, to lands granted by a guilty British government along the Grand River. Others stayed on shrinking reservations in New York, watching their remaining territory carved away by treaty after treaty in the decades that followed. The Confederacy itself did not die. The council fire would in time be rekindled, and the Haudenosaunee endure as nations to this very day. But the unbroken homeland, the long fields and the orchards, and the world the Seneca had been avenging at Cherry Valley, was gone for good. The frontier war ended, not with a reckoning, but with an erasure. The allies of both empires discarded the moment they were no longer useful. The cycle that began with raids on frontier farms, that escalated through Wyoming and Oquaga, that exploded at Cherry Valley and detonated through the Sullivan Campaign, did not resolve. It just consumed everything within reach. Two peoples, each convinced of the justice of its vengeance, each answering the last atrocity with a larger one, fought until the land they were fighting over was worthless to both. Gather the fates, the way these stories always end, because the frontier scattered its people to very different ends. Ichabod Alden died in the snow on the first morning, a few yards short of the fort he had refused to live in, killed by the weather he had sworn would protect him. His name survives mostly as a cautionary tale, the conventional officer who could not imagine the war he was actually in, and whose failure of imagination cost a village its life. Walter Butler, the most hated man in New York, got 2.5 more years. He was killed at West Canada Creek in 1781, shot in a small frontier skirmish. And there is no record that anyone on the Patriot side felt anything but satisfaction. The vengeance that had carried him out of an Albany prison carried him only that far. Joseph Brant, Thayendanegea, survived the war and lived for decades more, a leader of his people in the hard years of exile and resettlement that followed. But the name the colonies gave him stuck to his memory like tar. Monster Brant, the most restrained commander on the field at Cherry Valley, the man who saved Stacy and helped free 40 captives, spent the rest of history defending a reputation the propaganda had stolen from him. Modern historians have largely given it back, but it took a very long time. Lieutenant Colonel William Stacy, saved at the stake by a hand sign, saved at Niagara by a barrel of rum, survived his captivity and the war. The fierce patriot who tore up his king's commission got to grow old. The Reverend Samuel Dunlop, founder of the village, spared but forced to watch his wife murdered and his life's library burned, died the next year in New Jersey of a grief that had no other name. He had carried a congregation into the wilderness in 1741 and lived to see the wilderness take it all back. And Sayanquirata, Old Smoke, the septuagenarian Seneca chief. He spoke for the survivors of a burned world and led them back into a war that could no longer be won or lost, only endured. Cornplanter, the Seneca war chief who had helped lead the warriors at Cherry Valley, lived long into the new American century and spent those years walking the hardest road of all, the road of accommodation. He negotiated with the very republic that had burned his nation's towns, ceded land in treaties he believed would at least preserve something, and was condemned by some of his own people for dealing with the town destroyer's government. He died an old man on a grant of land along the Allegheny, having tried to keep his people alive in a world that had decided they should disappear. That name, Town Destroyer, is worth ending on, because it is the memory the Haudenosaunee kept when the colonies kept Jane Wells. The name itself was older than the Revolution. The Seneca had given a version of it to Washington decades before, and to his great-grandfather before him. But Sullivan's campaign filled it with new and terrible meaning. When the Seneca chief Cornplanter stood before President Washington in 1790, he reminded him of it. When your army entered the country of the Six Nations, he said, we called you Town Destroyer. And to this day, when that name is heard, Our women look behind them and turn pale, and our children cling to the necks of their mothers. The Haudenosaunee say they have called every president of the United States by that same name ever since. The Americans remembered Cherry Valley as a massacre done to them. The Haudenosaunee remembered the answer to it as the thing that defined the new nation's character toward them, and wrote that memory into the very title of its highest office. Two peoples, two memories of the same fire, each certain it was the one that had been wronged. There is a postscript that historians find it important to correct, because legends grow over hard ground. In later years, medieval-flavored romances claimed that the great Patriot general of the larger war was blinded and reduced to begging in the streets. Such tragic embellishments attach themselves to many of these figures. The public has always preferred a neater, sadder ending than the truth provides. The real fates were quieter and grimmer. Men who died short of a gate, men shot in a creek, women carrying infants through the snow, a minister dying of what he had seen. History rarely arranges itself into a moral. It just accumulates. Strip away the snow and the tomahawks and the propaganda, and Cherry Valley leaves behind a few hard truths that have not expired in 2.5 centuries. The first is about the man at the gate. Ichabod Alden died because he could not believe his enemy would do the thing his enemy was, at that very moment, doing. He had been warned, precisely, from a reliable source, and he answered the warning with the confidence of a professional certain he understood the rules. He represented a doctrine, the European way of war, with its assumptions about weather and logistics and the deterrent power of a fort, applied to a frontier that obeyed none of those assumptions. The lesson is older than Cherry Valley and outlived it by centuries. Rigid certainty about how an enemy must behave is a fatal liability against an enemy who has decided to behave otherwise. The armies that forget this relearn it in the snow. The second is about control. Walter Butler launched a raid he could not govern. He pinned his disciplined men against a fort and turned a grieving, ungovernable force loose on a valley of civilians, and then was shocked by the result. The atrocity was not a malfunction of his plan. It was the plan, executed by men whose reasons for fighting were not his reasons. A coalition is only as restrained as its angriest member, and an alliance built on incompatible griefs will produce the worst of what any of its members wants. The third is about the wheel itself. Every act of this story is an answer to a previous act. The raids answered the rebellion. Oquaga answered the raids. Cherry Valley answered Oquaga. Sullivan Clinton answered Cherry Valley 40 times over. And the survivors of Sullivan Clinton answered that with years more fire. No one in this story struck the first blow, because there was no first blow, only the next one. That is what a cycle of retaliation is, a machine for converting justice into ash, where every party is certain it is owed, and every payment makes the debt larger. And the fourth is about memory. Cherry Valley should be one of the most studied episodes of the Revolution. It exposed the failure of conventional command on the frontier. It cracked the British Indigenous Alliance from the inside. It pushed George Washington from containment to total war. It set in motion the campaign that broke the Confederacy and cleared upstate New York for the American expansion that followed. The blood spilled in that snow watered the seeds of the Iroquois' destruction and of a new nation's growth on the same ground. And yet most people have never heard of it. Ask 100 students to name a revolutionary battle, and you will hear Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown long before you hear Cherry Valley, if you hear it at all. There are concrete reasons for the silence, beyond the discomfort of the story itself. The first is a source problem. Much of what we know about the human detail of Cherry Valley, Jane Wells at the woodpile, the red hair on the scalp pole, the cap recognized in captivity, comes down through a relatively narrow channel of survivor testimony and local history, much of it gathered decades later and shaped by the perspective of one side. The Haudenosaunee left no comparable written archive of that day. Their account survives, mostly filtered through the people who fought them. When a battle's memory rests on a few partisan accounts rather than many independent ones, it is fragile. It survives only as long as someone keeps retelling it, and it is always vulnerable to the charge of embellishment. A charge that, with these sources, cannot always be fully answered. A careful telling has to hold that uncertainty in view, rather than pretend to a precision the record does not support. The second is a narrative problem. The battles that lodge in national memory tend to offer a clean shape, a heroic stand, a decisive turning point, a clear victor whose triumph the nation can claim as its own. Saratoga turned the war. Yorktown ended it. Even a defeat like the Alamo gives you martyrs to rally around. Cherry Valley offers none of that. It is a defensive disaster caused by the defender's own commander, an atrocity with culpability smeared across every party, and a strategic aftermath that did not resolve the frontier but inflamed it for years. There is no clean victory to celebrate and no clean villain to hate, only Walter Butler, and even he is half explained by the prison and the burned towns behind him. A story with no one to root for does not get told around the fire. The third is a problem of inheritance. Triumphant memory needs a continuous people to carry it forward and claim the legacy. But the world Cherry Valley belonged to was dismantled within a generation. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy that the massacre helped to break had no interest in memorializing the worst chapter of its own destruction. The Loyalists who fought there scattered to Canada, written out of the American story entirely, and the New Republic, busy building a flattering founding myth, had little use for an episode that showed its army burning a people's winter food to starve them out, and its general ordering the devastation of a nation. Everyone who might have kept the memory had a reason to let it sink, so it sank. Why? Because it does not fit the story America tells itself about its founding. It has no clean heroism, no Spartan stand, no triumphant cause. It has a negligent colonel, a vengeful captain, a maligned chief, and dozens of dead farmers and warriors and children on both sides of a line that everyone kept crossing. It is a story of failure and atrocity and consequence, with no comfortable side to root for. It does not inspire. It indicts. So it was forgotten, deliberately, the way painful things are. The propaganda remembered Jane Wells at the woodpile and forgot the burned towns and the starving winter that had set the whole tragedy in motion. The national memory kept the parts that flattered and discarded the parts that complicated. And Cherry Valley sank out of the textbooks, leaving behind only the ruins and the fields, which do not remember anything at all. We began with a colonel running through the snow toward a fort he had refused to live in, a soaked pistol misfiring in his hand, a tomahawk closing the distance his own arrogance had created. We end with the same snow, and a valley emptied of everything that had made it worth fighting over. More than 30 civilians dead, 16 soldiers, 70 carried into the wilderness, 60 families worth of homes and mills and church and library reduced to char in a single afternoon. And reaching back behind it, the burned towns of Oquaga and Unadilla and the winter of starvation they set in motion. And reaching forward, 160,000 bushels of burned corn, 5,000 refugees, and a winter at Niagara that killed by the hundreds and the thousands without a shot fired. The numbers are real, where we have them, and honestly uncertain where we do not. The attacking force was somewhere between 600 and 700. The warriors numbered, by various counts, anywhere from around 300 to over 400. The dead at Cherry Valley we can roughly count. More than 30 civilians and 16 soldiers. The dead of the long winter that followed the Sullivan campaign we can only estimate. The sources are partial and partisan, written mostly by one side about the other, and a careful telling has to hold the gaps as honestly as the facts. But the shape of the thing is not uncertain at all. Cherry Valley was not a battle between civilization and savagery. It was the place where two peoples, each pushed past the unthinkable by what had already been done to them, did the unthinkable to each other. And then a young nation chose the parts of that horror it wished to remember and buried the rest under the snow with the bodies. Joseph Brant pulled a man off a torture stake and was called a monster for the day's work. Ichabod Alden was warned exactly what was coming and called it impossible. A girl who had learned her neighbor's language pleaded for her life in it and died anyway. And a year later, her blood-stained cap was pressed into the hands of another captive 100 miles away. The frontier's grim way of carrying its dead. None of these people is a symbol. All of them were real. That is the part the propaganda could not use, and the part worth remembering. The ruins of the war are gone now. The village was rebuilt. The orchards regrew where they were allowed to. The snow melted, as it always does, into ordinary spring. The Mohawk Valley took generations to recover, and the Haudenosaunee took far longer, and some wounds from that ground have never fully closed. But the lesson waits where it has always waited, in the gap between those who believe their enemy will follow the rules and those who have already decided not to. In the difference between fighting a war and feeding a cycle. In the cost of answering every atrocity with a larger one until there is nothing left to win. Cherry Valley bled the Mohawk Valley dry. And the most haunting thing about it is not that it happened. It is that everyone involved believed, right up to the moment the tomahawk left the hand, that they were the ones being wronged. The snow fell, the village burned, and the wheel turned again.